trick question. What is inflation and why is it so bad? If you follow politics, you know that inflation is the reason the Democrats will probably get their asses handed to them in November. But if you don't follow politics, you've at least noticed that the price of everything is fucking skyrocketing right now. Alright, so we get that inflation is the reason why shit is getting more expensive. But why does shit have to get more expensive, and who gets to decide how much costs go up? Is there anything we can do about it, or is this just one of the many ways that we're at the mercy of greedy corporations or big government or both? Well, believe it or not, we actually are still figuring out the answers to a lot of these questions. But before we get into what we do and don't know, we've got to make sure that you know how money even works in the first place.
If you saw our episode on how crypto works, you'll know that we've come a long way from our ancestors trading skins and shiny bits of metal. Because it's really cumbersome to trade in just raw materials, villages, banks, and eventually countries had to find ways to quickly and easily exchange value. It began as these paper promissory notes, basically just glorified IOUs that you could bring to a bank in exchange for gold. Sure, the value of that IOU was somewhat tied to the value of something tangible, but the real thing that made it valuable was faith. Over time, this system encountered a bunch of different issues and subsequently evolved into the system that we have now. That IOU now exists as a bit of code on a server managed by your bank. And that bit of code is tied to the value of that glorified paper IOU, which is in turn sorta tied to the value of a bunch of different commodities and other valuable things. But really, the thing that gives value to each little dollar and cent in yours or anyone's bank account is faith, along with the knowledge that we have to believe in a currency in order for it to work. And right now, the main bank that helps the US back up its IOUs is the Federal Reserve.
And if any part of that sounds confusing, you can click the link below to see our entire video explaining how currencies work. But also understand that people spend years studying and getting degrees in all the various ways that we turn faith into money, and there's only so much we can do in the span of a few 3-minute TikToks, so maybe cut us some slack? But anyways, back to inflation. All you need to know is that the entire system runs on faith.
Inflation is one of those things that happens when you start letting faith and credibility stand in for actual goods and services. And again, there's definitely benefits to doing this. But there's also some second-order effects. A lot of TikTok and YouTube videos will tell you that the root cause of inflation is central banks printing more money. More dollars overall means that the value of each individual dollar goes down, so then each dollar ends up buying you less and less. And while all of that is true, it doesn't tell the whole story, because it's not like central banks are just doing it for the vine. To a certain extent, we need to put more currency into circulation to keep the costs of living stable as the economy grows. If we only have a finite amount of dollars or any currency in circulation, that makes things a lot harder as we try to invent new products and services and industries to meet the needs of a growing population. And as the population grows, that means more consumers with more needs and wants, or as finance bros call it, demand, for goods and services. That increased demand naturally drives prices up. And when prices for certain materials go up, it makes other goods and services more expensive to produce or to provide. And when the cost of doing business goes up, so do the prices. And then when prices for everything go up, people's wages also have to go up. Otherwise, they get poorer through no fault of their own. So that's why central banks have to print more money to make sure that all of these costs and demands grow as slowly and predictably as possible.
So then why is inflation so bad right now? Well, maybe you can think of something that happened recently that completely upended global supply chains, drove demand for certain goods and services through the roof, and is still affecting countries and economies around the world to this day. And now conservatives want to blame Biden and the Democrats for making inflation worse by giving people money during the pandemic to stay home and not work. But barring all of the ethical and medical reasons to make sure that people can stay home safely during a pandemic, giving people money is not what drove demand through the roof in the first place. It just made sure that everyday people could stay afloat while demand continued to increase. Besides, it's not the president or Congress or anybody in government that sets the price for goods and services. It's the companies and the corporations that do that.
They don't even run the Federal Reserve, since it's a separate entity run by a board of governors with a bunch of different locations around the country. The only thing the federal government can control is who sits as the chair and on the board of governors, who are each nominated by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. And even then, the Federal Reserve, or the Fed for short, can't control what companies charge for goods and services. All they can do is loan money to other banks so that they can make sure they have enough cash on hand to guarantee the transactions going on in their books. That means they only have control over a handful of things. They can control the requirements for how much cash banks need to keep on hand, they can control the rate of interest they charge for banks that they lend to, and when those rates are low, banks have more of an incentive to loan more money to consumers who can use it to buy houses, cars, you name it. Higher spending means higher growth, which can mean higher inflation. And when those interest rates are higher, borrowing becomes a lot harder, and so there's less incentive to spend money. And while slowing growth can keep inflation in check, it can also trigger a recession, which means the Fed has to constantly walk a tightrope with its interest rates to try and make sure that inflation stays at a slow and steady 2%.
But remember, it's not the government or the Fed that ends up setting prices. So if corporations want to exploit a global emergency and jack up prices while they collect record profits, then there's not a whole lot we can do about it. We can encourage our representatives to pass a windfall profits tax that makes companies pay up when they try to profit from tragedy. They can try to make certain forms of price gouging illegal. They can even break up companies that get too big and gobble up too much competition. And as consumers, we can make it a point to not give money to companies that try to profit from tragedy. But at the end of the day, being out of control to a certain extent is just one of the costs of having a so-called free market.